I want to start off with the transport stuff and the airfare stuff of this week. A simple question. Are domestic airfares too expensive?
I think at times they can be, and I think you can look at occasions where if you've got to take 3 kids to a funeral up north and you're spending $1,200 return each, that's hard. That is really hard. So at times they can be, and I know there are all sorts of reasons why, and we can let Air New Zealand explain that. But I guess our job in this is to figure out what are the things that we can do to help relieve that pressure.
So do you think Air New Zealand is charging too much at times?
I think it depends on your personal circumstances. I certainly think that most people couldn't afford a $600 airfare, and it is difficult. So yeah, at times I think the fares are high, but they've got commercial decisions to make, and I understand there are all the issues around costs and pilots and parts and planes and all that kind of stuff. So whether or not I think it's too high or not, it's certainly high for many people, and it makes travel difficult.
There are lots of airlines in the world. If you believe in market forces, and Air New Zealand is at times charging too much in the view of some people, why doesn't Air New Zealand face more competition?
I think part of it is the size of our market. You've got to have a market which is large enough for those international competitors and other competitors to be able to come in and say, yep, we actually think we can make a return and we can provide a service here. You see that a little bit on our main routes with Jetstar being a good competitor. I said this last week, the routes where Jetstar flies, the reliability is better and the prices are lower. So I think competition does make a difference. You see that also with some of our smaller regional airlines where they can come in and they can disrupt a little bit and put a bit of pressure on. And one of the big criticisms that I get locally is that the risk that new airlines coming in means that Air New Zealand will drop their prices and try and compete them out of the space. I don't mind that. I don't mind if a competitor came into Timaru Airport and all of a sudden the airfares got reduced by 30-40%. But the trouble is that our market isn't probably big enough to encourage those competitors in at the moment. So we're looking at things that we can do to help encourage competition.
But shouldn't it be big enough if indeed Air New Zealand is overcharging people? If Air New Zealand is charging too much, then surely there's a ripe opportunity for another player to come in and charge less.
That would be the argument, and that would lead you to think that perhaps they aren't overcharging, because if there was money left on the floor, there would be lots of money there for airlines to come in and make it.
But you say they are for some people.
For some people they are charging, but that depends on personal circumstances. You and I can probably get around and afford to fly quite happily if we need to go somewhere at last minute. But if you were even a single person needing to fly from Timaru to Auckland for a funeral at short notice, that might cost you $1,400-1,500 plus accommodation, plus travel to the airport and all that kind of stuff. So individual circumstances will mean it's expensive. That doesn't necessarily mean there are super huge amounts of money to be made by competitors, but we can look at what are we doing to make it more affordable for airlines to come in and compete with Air New Zealand as well.
So explain to me the economic rationale behind incentivising competition against a company for which you are the majority shareholder.
Yeah, well, there's an economic tension there, isn't there? Because
it's more than an economic tension,
the taxpayer owns Air New Zealand, and the taxpayer should demand a dividend from that, because that's part of the reason for investing in them. The other part is that there is a sense of value in public ownership for the national carrier and some of the public service requirements that might come with that. Now, those are really decisions that fall a little bit out of my purview and are shareholding ministers' decisions. But the thing that we care about most is the fact that consumers need to have choice, especially in the South Island. You've got to have choice when you are already geographically isolated. And so things that we can do to reduce pressure on airfares are, I think, a good step. And some of that might be options like investing in our airport infrastructure to reduce the costs on airports, who can reduce the costs on airlines and landing fees and make it more sustainable for smaller airlines to operate as well.
So to be totally clear, you want to see competition against Air New Zealand?
Yeah, I think that'd be fair to say, because I think what that does is that means that Air New Zealand can still get a good commercial return for its shareholders, which, taxpayers and private individuals, but also means that they stay sharp and competitive on routes, and they stay focused on improving their reliability, making sure they've got good connections at good times of the day. Sometimes the schedule doesn't quite fit what you need to do to grow the economy in the South Island, and it also means that they'll keep an eye on their airfares.
You said that there's an economic tension there. Surely it's economically nonsensical to be incentivising competition for a company from which you make millions of dollars in revenue every year.
Well, only to the point where it would significantly hurt the return from that company, right? There could be things that drives New Zealand to do to improve their efficiencies and to improve their reliability and their offerings without impacting their bottom line. It could be the case that there are some things that government can do to help with their input costs to make sure that if you have more competition, it doesn't actually impact the profit that Air New Zealand makes and therefore passes on as a dividend, but still is better for the consumer. So I do think there are some things we can do in there without significantly impacting Air New Zealand's operations.
What would be top of the list?
Well, I think our investment in airport infrastructure is a key thing. You've seen a bit of that already over on the West Coast. I was at Hokitika Airport last week, and there's some investment going in there from the Regional Infrastructure Fund. And that's important because A, it maintains the viability of those airports, but B, it means the airports get a little bit of assistance so that they don't have to up their landing fees and make it uncompetitive for smaller airlines to come in. That means you get the likes of Sounds Air and Chatham's and Origin and Sun Air and all those new players who can actually provide a service that Air New Zealand might not necessarily be able to justify economically. I'm sure if you asked Air New Zealand whether or not they make a huge amount of money flying to the regions, they'll probably say probably not. But they do provide those services because they realise the social value and the value of being a national carrier there too. But we can't rely on just Air New Zealand to service the regions. We do need the likes of the players up in Barrier Area, up in Whangarei, and people around Nelson and around Tauranga as well.
The Treaty Principles Bill. You oversaw the Treaty Principles Select Committee process. And we know that national MPs voted as a caucus, but I just wondered, after that experience, where do you stand personally on the bill? Do you actually oppose the substance of the bill as it was described?
Well, as a member of the government, and there was a government position on this agreed by obviously coalition partners, I'm bound by what our government policy is on that. So
you can still have a view. I'm not suggesting you change your vote or anything like that. I just wonder what your position is on the actual substance of the bill.
I will come to it, but it's an interesting thing that when you are a minister in government, you do forego a lot of personal views because you then become bound by the collective responsibility doctrines of cabinet and of the Cabinet Manual, which applies to ministers outside of Cabinet as well. So I don't want it to sound like it's a non-answer, but I actually don't hold personal views on issues of government policy because I am bound by what the government says on that. But in terms of where the bill sat for us as a caucus, we never supported the idea of the bill. We supported it going through to Select Committee as a coalition and to give it the due process and treatment that it deserved as a piece of legislation going through the process. Now, not everyone was happy with the extent of that. Not everyone was happy that it was there in the first place. Some people think it should have been there longer. I think we were consistent in our treatment of the bill throughout, and I actually think we treated it quite fairly and gave as many people as possible the chance to have their views heard.
You certainly did. 300,000 plus submissions. I'll get to those in a couple of minutes. Maybe I can get to the question I want answered by going at it a different way. Having considered so many of those submissions, and personally, does Te Tiriti or Waitangi specifically guarantee rights to Māori that were not guaranteed in the treaty or Te Tiriti to other New Zealanders?
I think that's a contested answer.
What's your answer to that?
Well, I can reflect on some of the submissions that came through because people who were opposed to the bill gave opposing answers to that question. Some people said, yes, of course, it gives different rights to the signatories to the treaty, iwi and hapu.
What's your position, having considered arguments on both sides of that? Does Te Tiriti or Waitangi guarantee Māori specific rights that were not necessarily guaranteed to other New Zealanders?
My view is the one that the government holds, which is that rights under the treaty are basically found within statute law and within treaty settlements, and the application of statute law to that. Beyond that, the rights that every New Zealander has are the same. But we operate in a system where those rights are challenged and sometimes they are interpreted differently in the court. So I think that Mr Seymour's arguments around clarifying what the principles are was a worthwhile one to have. We didn't necessarily think it was the one that this bill would solve. We've got other mechanisms and other coalition commitments around reviewing treaty principles that we think can more properly address those on a case-by-case basis. So using a specific solution to deal with specific problems rather than a broad brush approach that perhaps some of the legal interpretations from the court have got us into strife with recently as well.
How did overseeing that process and engaging with the submissions impact the way that you think about your own Māori whakapapa?
I have been asked this a couple of times. It didn't significantly impact, apart from the realisation, and increasingly so as a chair of the Select Committee, where we got a lot of people coming in talking about the Māori worldview on this or Māori think that. The idea that there are a lot of people out there who think that all Māori or all people who whakapapa Māori think the same. And that's clearly not the case, even through the select committee process. I mean, you've got the author of the bill, whakapapa's Māori, and has a different view on these things. So it didn't alter how I think about myself. It sort of made me realise that more people than I thought think that we think homogeneously and that there is one particular worldview, and that's something that doesn't sit comfortably with me, because if I don't then fit within that worldview, where does that make me sit in terms of having Māori whakapapa? Does it mean I don't count anymore? Well, obviously that can't be the case. Just because I've got a different view on maybe rights around property doesn't mean that I'm no longer Māori. So it's an interesting situation to be in, and not something that I've been able to probably put enough thought to.
Do you think that same phenomenon extends beyond race? Do you think that same phenomenon is kind of particularly prominent in what is, for want of a better term, an identity politics era?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I alluded to that in my main speech a little bit, where we make assumptions about an individual's worldview based on their background, and saying that, yep, you grew up in a working class part of town, your dad was a freezing worker and your mum brought you up on her own, so therefore you should be a Labour voter. Well, that ascribes a certain worldview based on a prejudice or a stereotype of where those people should end up thinking. And I think it devalues what I have to offer as an individual and my experiences within my family and my community. So I think you're right. I think it extends from race to everything from gender to culture to nationality to age to whether or not you believe in the working class structure. To think that all working class people think X, Y, Z is not a helpful way, I think, of thinking.
300,000 plus submissions for the Treaty Principles Bill. Do you think our select committee process and the submissions process is fit for this age? Because when you reflect on a lot of those submissions, many were just cut and paste jobs, many had been put through third parties who might have a range of motivations for driving up support for submissions. How do you reflect on that?
I think there is a piece of work that needs to be done there when we go through the standing orders review that the public are able to submit on, that looks at what is the purpose of the select committee process. So fundamentally it is supposed to be about helping legislators who are looking at a particular bill consider what are the impacts of that bill, how to improve it, what might need to be changed, what is the wording of the actual statute. And where it's morphed into, I think recently over the past 5 to 10 years with some of the more high profile bits of legislation, is it's become an advocacy piece or a chance to have a referendum or a vote on a particular issue. I don't think that's helpful, because our system's set up to make it a process where it helps legislators figure out, is this bill got good things in it or bad things in it? What do we need to change? What words? Does a comma make a difference here? Yeah. All that kind of technical stuff that you don't see out in the public. So I think it's worth looking at whether or not, we have pretty open access to who can make a submission, how you make it. You're right, you can go online and you can tick a few boxes and someone will send a submission in on your behalf. Now, we actually had to think about that from a volume perspective. If you got 10,000 submissions saying the same thing, is that an actual submission? Is that helpful to the process? Or should we say, well, actually, the third party that's used that to collect your data and is just passing them on, that should be treated as one submission from that third party, noting that 10,000 people have inputted into it. There are difficult conversations to have there, because some people think that you should have free, unhindered access to the process. Some people think that you need to be able to prove that you're, over 18 and you're a New Zealander to be able to make a submission. And those are contested ideas.
You are the Minister for the South Island. So the South Island makes up 23% of the population, 22% of GDP. But as I'm sure you're aware, there are twice as many Chris's in Cabinet than there are ministers from the South Island. What does that say about the regard your government has for the people of the South?
Well, obviously Chris is a very popular name, and I'm very disappointed that we seem to be tracking downwards in terms of the number of Jameses in Parliament. We've already lost one this term, and I'm not hoping that we'll lose any more. Look, I think what it reflects is that if you were looking for a perfectly proportional representative Parliament, the only way to get that absolutely pin perfect would be to go and do some sort of weighted ranking program.
There's pin perfect, like perfectly representative, yep. And then there's one South Island minister in the whole of Cabinet.
Oh, in Cabinet, right. Yeah, okay, I follow your point. There is difficulties, I guess, with this particular Cabinet, because there are coalition considerations to go into, and there are decisions around making sure you've got the best person for the job. But ultimately, I think that your Cabinet should be made up of the best people for the job. And what I maybe need to do as a South Island Minister is, as we lead up to the next election, make sure that when I'm out there, I'm advocating for as many good, high-quality South Island candidates to come through our system, to get into Parliament, to make sure that we can have much more of a broader offering to get more South Islanders into Cabinet. But ultimately...
So you're saying at the moment, there actually isn't, if it's merit-based, keeping in mind the coalition considerations, there aren't South Island ministers who are good enough to be in Cabinet?
Oh, well, there absolutely are, and you see that there is an excellent South Island minister in Cabinet, and of course the Prime Minister would consider himself to be a South Islander at heart just because he's been living across the Cook Strait for a while. I think he still has his Crusaders top underneath his jersey whenever he comes to caucus. But look, ultimately what you want out of your Cabinet is you want a high quality Cabinet, a group of ministers who are focused on decisions that are the best for the country. And to a certain extent, it's helpful to have geographic representation from across the board because that helps you identify particular issues that it might affect a particular geographic region differently. That's part of my job, is to provide that lens where there's a government policy or a project which might have a particular impact on the South Island. I'm to feed into ministers on that. But actually, we've got clever enough people to recognise that they're making decisions on behalf of the whole country, and where a housing issue or where a health issue affects Dunedin differently to Dannevirke, that will do that.
So what's the point in you?
Well, the point of me is to make sure that we've got a large geographic area down here. Not all parts of the South Island have the same issues. We've got common themes.
See, so like in one breath it is important to have representation, in one breath it isn't.
Well, I think I'm not there for representation. I think I'm there to make sure that particular issues and perhaps...
But you've just said
policies,
that the Cabinet is keeping an eye on these different issues, and they're able to, consider the issues that are most pertinent to the region.
Yeah, and they do their best, but it is hard to get around the South Island. I mean, I've spent the last 3 months trying to get around as much of my home as possible. I spent 3.5 days on the West Coast last week, and I still wasn't able to traverse a fraction of the electorate. So it's a just substantially a large area, and to try and get ministers to be able to get on the ground and talk to as many people as they need to is hard to do. So part of my job is that I can be ears and eyes on the ground so that I can feed back what I'm hearing from locals about their particular issues, because the issues in, let's take a place like Ralston and Lincoln in the Selwyn electorate, putting aside the weather events, the sort of challenges around growth and housing in Ralston and Selwyn and Central Otago are differently to the challenges that we have here in South Canterbury, where we don't have the same kind of growth. So to assume that all the problems and challenges in the South Island are the same would be a mistake to make. So part of my job is to be able to make sure that when we're talking about housing policy, I can say to things like land use change, actually that affects the provincial parts of the South Island really, really significantly, and it's something that we need to be cautious about when we're making changes, and something that might not have been brought to the attention of ministers because they physically can't get there.
Okay, you got no department, you got no budget. Last I checked, written questions, no KPIs, no seat at the Cabinet table. Can you give us a specific example, though, of a Cabinet colleague's decision that you have influenced since being appointed to the job?
Not yet, because the particular decisions I'm thinking about haven't quite yet been made or released. But here are some examples of things that I can think of. You've got tourism as a major contributor to our economy down here in the South Island. There are some challenges around the cruise industry, and so one of the things that I've been working on with Tourism Minister Louise Upston is how can we encourage more cruise ships into the South Island, and there are issues there around surety of access, there are issues around fees, there are issues around port access, and there are issues around particularly biofouling. And so part of what I've been doing is working with Ministers Upston and Pōtaka around how do we make sure that the South Island benefits from tourism. So that could be one example I can think of, and I'll address the issue of not having a department. I actually don't think you need a large bureaucracy or a department to be able to make significant change in advocacy in this space. I think that I honestly think that I've got enough influence and enough of an understanding of what our issues are here to be able to talk directly to ministers and their portfolios about what we need down here.
So then did you consult Simeon Brown before he released the health info plan on Deneden Hospital?
Didn't consult him on that particular plan.
I mean, that's a giant thing for the South Island, right? Like more than cruise ships, you arguably the Deneden Hospital issue is a far greater concern to more of the constituents in the South.
Yes, so didn't consult with him on the release of that plan, but talked regularly with Simeon and his office about the health infrastructure needs down here in the South Island, so in particular around Dunedin, and I'm aware of the ongoing issues around access to, say, maternity care in Central Otago, operating theatres here in Timaru, the state of the rebuild project up in Nelson. So I'm in regular contact with Minister Brown on that situation. But again, look at the outcome of the plan, and you can see significant investments in there on the South Island on that plan.
It's just the influence that you are or are not able to have in this role, sitting outside of Cabinet, right? So he made that announcement in February. He left off information at the time about reducing the number of intensive care beds that will be established on day one of the hospital's establishment. I mean, did you have a say in that?
In February?
Did you have a say in the number of ICU beds in Deneden Hospital, for example?
No, I think I'd been a minister for about 7 days at that point, and then the announcement was made a couple of weeks later.
Nonetheless, I mean, this is surely, given the importance of that issue to the South, as the Minister for the South Island, you would expect to have some say or consultation over something like that?
Yeah, but I'm comfortable with where we sit with the Deneden Hospital announcement because we've put the investment into the rebuild. On day one, it'll go from 16, which it is at the moment, to 20, and on day one and opening, with capacity to go to 30 pretty quickly, and then capacity again as demand requires to go to 40. But
so the question's not whether or not you're comfortable, the question is whether or not you're consulted, like whether or not you actually are able to exert influence through this role, right? Which is what I'm just trying to nut down. And so if you're not consulted at all before those announcements are made, I mean, it's all well and good to say that you're happy with them afterwards, but the point is that you didn't have influence at the time of the decision making.
Yeah, and I am consulted on significant announcements for the South Island and policy areas for the South Island, so infrastructure projects are one of those ones we're working on at the moment. For that particular round around the Deneden Hospital, I think we've got to be a little bit cautious about, I was sworn in on the 24th of January and I think that announcement was made 2 weeks later. So in terms of there being literally time to come along and rush along to me and say, what do you think of this proposal? I think maybe we can get a bit of a pass mark for not having night-long meetings for that one. But look, in general, the expectation from the Prime Minister is pretty clear. So my job is to be proactive about reaching out to other ministers and about A, offering my support down here in the South Island, but B, expecting to have some input into decisions that are significant. Now that will take time, and the challenge is that could mean my portfolio is as broad as I could make it. I could dip my toe into every single portfolio and ask to be consulted on everything. That's not going to happen. It's not going to be helpful because there's just no time to be able to do that. So I've got to think about what are the really key things for me as Minister for the South Island that I want to focus on. And the number one thing is helping Nicola Willis do her job around economic growth. So what can I do to help encourage projects and policies that encourage growth in the South Island? It's about making sure that we've got good transport and logistics connections, and you've seen that a few days ago when you came down and you would have seen the state of the state highways and some of the risks around not being connected and getting to places there. And then of course delivery of high quality public services, and that's where I think that education and health piece comes in.
So you're the Minister for Youth. Last year, more New Zealanders left this country than any year in recorded history. I think almost 3/4 were under the age of 35, and it followed a similarly huge exodus the year before. Why do so many young New Zealanders want to leave, do you think?
There's a couple of things in that space I think that are important to acknowledge. That's that young people have always wanted to go and travel and explore, and actually I come from the space where I think that if you're a high schooler leaving school and you're a little bit indeterminate about what you want to do, it's actually okay to go and do a gap year. That means you get a year to grow up, you get a year to have a chance to explore the world. It might mean you go to trades training or a university better prepared. So I think there's always been a natural flow of people wanting to leave the nest and explore. The second part is that I think COVID confined a whole generation almost into their homes and into their country, and so you have that itch to be able to go and explore quickly. So we're seeing cohorts leave in larger numbers than maybe what we would have seen in the past. But then of course the other challenge is that it's been tough economically over the past few years, and it's understandable that if young people who are ambitious and want to get ahead, they'll look for opportunities to do that. So we've got to make sure that we make this a country that is so appealing and so appetising that if they do go offshore for a while, they want to come back and they know that there are jobs and places to raise their kids, because ultimately they want to be here. They're New Zealanders, they want to raise their family here, and we've got to make sure there are the jobs and incomes to be able to do that.
Are there specific policies? I know it's all well and good to say, economic growth, but I mean, name me the last time New Zealand was in a stronger economic position or had higher wages than Australia. Are there specific policies that you think should be prioritised in trying to bring some of those people back?
Yeah, I think we can look at what Australia does with their natural resources and look to see how we can move at a similar pace as what they do. Ultimately, they're a wealthy country and they're a much wealthier country than us. So trying to compete with them on price is always going to be difficult. But we can compete on lifestyle and the fact that we are a wonderful place to live. So there are things we can do in that mineral sector, and I know the work of Shane Jones working on the West Coast, having been there last week, the absolute appetite to be able to use the resources that we have in a sensible and sustainable way is good. That will create jobs, so fast track processes, RMA reform, being able to get those projects up and running will be good. There are things we can do in the health workforce space in terms of, and teaching as well actually, to make the costs of being in those professions lower and make it more attractive for young people to stay here in the first instance. If you want to train nurses, we've got a brilliant place to train nurses here in Timaru at ARA. But you know, if you're wanting to enter the nursing workforce in your mid-20s or late 20s and you've already got a family, having to travel to do that and the upfront costs of doing that are hard. So if we can bond people and say that if you stay and you continue to work in rural sectors, you get some of your loan paid off, that'll be some policies that might help there as well. And of course you had last week Minister Brown announced more rural medicine training places, and we've got a great facility on the West Coast in Greymouth with Grey Hospital, but we also do rural medical training in Ashburton too. And they're the kind of things, you train your own, you make sure you've got homegrown doctors and nurses, they're more likely to stay home, they're more likely to work in those areas where they come from.
You and I are of the same generation. I'm sure you, like me, have lots of Kiwi friends who've moved across the ditch and have been over there and have considered moving back at some point. A friend over there did the sums recently, looked at his superannuation, 12% he's getting matched at the moment. He looks at New Zealand and he goes, you know what, my future has to be in Australia because this is where I'm going to have the greatest level of economic prosperity. What about superannuation? Are there policies that you think we should prioritise that might help ease that shift back for New Zealanders who have been living abroad?
Yeah, I think we can do work in the space of basically getting us into a savings mindset. And there might be a whole range of policies that Minister Willis and the Revenue Minister are looking at in order to encourage that. But the key thing is how do we make sure people are interested in saving and investing for their retirement? What can we do to incentivise that? What can we do to change the culture of the country in terms of saving? And it can be hard. I mean, for a long time, I didn't contribute much to my Kiwi Saver because I was young. I was in my early 20s. I wanted the money there and then because I had to pay rent and I had to buy groceries and pay fuel. And it's hard to think of what 65-year-old James is going to do with the money. I mean, that's a problem for future me.
Yeah, I know, but this is not like, it's not really much of a pitch, is it? To say to us, oh yeah, you're getting 12% matched by your employer in Australia, come back to New Zealand where you're going to be in charge of it by yourself.
But that then goes back to the fact that Australia are a much wealthier country. So how do we put businesses in that position where they can match a payment of 12% if it's just going to drive them to the wall if they can't afford to do it in the first place?
I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying, you know, are there tweaks to the policy that, you know, might make it a more attractive proposition in New Zealand?
Yeah, there could be. The trade-off always being that if you increase the costs on employers, what does that do to their ability to hire the next worker? What does that do to their ability to invest in their business and expand and create more jobs? So I think underlying all of that, there are tweaks and changes you can make to the savings mantra and system. But if you get higher economic growth, and it sounds like a bit of a broken record, but higher economic growth means higher incomes, means you can save more and businesses can contribute more as well.
What would means testing the government Kiwi Saver contributions mean for New Zealanders who are considering the move back?
Do you mean in terms of if you make X amount?
If you make a certain amount of money, you don't get the full government contribution as it stands, $500 and whatever dollars.
Well, I haven't thought about the consequences of that. I would have thought that if it applies to higher income earners, there's probably less impact on them because they're able to voluntarily increase their contributions more. I mean, they can go from 3 to 8%.
They don't get the free government $500 contribution.
Well, it's not free, of course. I mean, the supermarket workers and the freezing workers and the farmers all pay for that. So it's not necessarily a free contribution.
All pay for it. Yeah,
we all pay for it. But in terms of what difference would that make, that $500 a year make to someone earning $180,000?
If we started means testing the government contribution, the annual government contribution to Kiwi Saver, what would that mean for someone in Australia considering coming back to New Zealand? Right.
Well, you would assume it would make them, that teeny tiny bit more sceptical about coming back. But if you can do that in a way which then drastically improves the quality of our education system so that their kids have a great future, if we can do that to invest in our police force to make sure it's a safe place to live,
It's probably not going to drastically improve the education,
No.
is it? If it's a teeny tiny bit of money, then it's not going to drastically improve things at the other end.
It's kind of the trade-off, isn't it? If it's not going to drastically improve things, it's probably not going to drastically be a massive disincentive as well. So all of those things in balance. I'm not sure what the total impact would be, but you'd hope that if you're weighing up the decision whether to come back from somewhere like Australia to live in New Zealand, that we could have a country that has the opportunities for those people, despite some of the minor differences in settings around superannuation, for instance.
Social media, would you ban it for under 16s?
It's a topic that's been raised with me directly by a number of organisations, and it's something that we, I guess, as a country are looking at to see what's happening in Australia. It's difficult because as the Minister for Youth, there are a wide range of views on whether or not something like restrictions on social media would be a good thing or a bad thing. You ask some people, they see it as an amplifier for a lot of good. That creates communities. It means they've got access to resources and help that they wouldn't normally get. But for other things, it amplifies the bad as well. So it means that bullying is amplified if you get into a scrap at school, at Cashmere High School, when you were going through school. If you got into a little bit of a scrap, maybe it went around the school and by Tuesday it was done. Now it's filmed, it's put online, it's not only in your community, it's in your country, it's in the world, and it's there forever.
Yeah, so on the balance of all of those, I mean, the good and the bad can exist at the same time, but if one is outweighing the other, then it might be time for a policy response in the eyes of some.
It could be, and the evidence on the overall positivity or negativity on social media is mixed, so it's hard to then make a hard call on, but there should be some restrictions in place. It'd be interesting to see how Australia goes in theirs. They've of course put a social media ban in place, which is due to come into effect, I think, around about December. And it's a little bit about that. We didn't grow up in the social media generation, so I don't know what it's like to have my entire life involved in it. But what are the consequences to young people of cutting them off completely? And can you do it? Will they find ways around it? All those other things. But it's certainly a conversation worth having, because I know parents are very, very concerned about the impact it has on young people. And I'm concerned because, I mean, as someone who's almost forced to be on social media in terms of being able to interact with my constituents, there is behaviour on there which you would not see in the street. And you walk up and down Stafford Street, you're not going to have a random stranger come up to you and yell in your face that you're a useless person, you're doing a terrible job. You might get that every now and then at a public meeting, but that's what happens day after day after day in our jobs, and it's probably exacerbated for different people in different professions as well.
Is it just that 16-year-olds who pay income tax don't get to vote on how those taxes are spent?
It depends on who you ask.
What's your view? You keep on saying that. You keep on saying, here's the side and here's the side. What's your view?
Well, that's a good balanced approach to any kind of answer, isn't it? Here are the pros,
well,
here are the
I'm not
cons.
sure it's leadership necessarily, though, is it? I mean, what's your position?
Well, we at least think it's justified, right? Like, so we've had a voting age of 18 for many, many decades. It's one which is consistent across many, many jurisdictions as well. If you're a 16-year-old, you might feel like you're getting a raw deal because you pay tax. But of course, there are a number of people who pay tax in this country who don't have the right to vote. If you're a non-resident and you're here and you're paying PAYE and you're working, you don't have the right to vote as well. So there are always limits and restrictions placed on who can vote and who can't vote. So I think you've got to draw the line in the sand somewhere. There are certainly arguments that have been made very strongly up to the Supreme Court about 16. We're very comfortable with 18 being the age. And the flip side to that is we just talked about the pressures being placed on young people with social media. And then we want to go and put even more pressure on them by saying you're figuring out who you are, you're making your way in the world, you're making a bit of coin here and there. And also we're now going to give you the added responsibility and pressure of going out and being a voter as well. At some stage...
It's pressure, is it necessarily?
Well, I mean, for some of those young people...
They don't have to vote.
No, that's right. But for some of them who feel very strongly, very deeply about this, they do feel a lot of pressure to go out and be active. And at some stage we've got to think, do we just allow young people and kids to be kids for as long as they can before we start burdening them with the responsibilities that, as adults we should be taking on? I think we do that a little bit too much in our society as it is. We say, young people, you should all go and be independent, free-thinking, structure your own education, learn for yourself, go out and experience the world, and we're going to just be totally hands-off. I think there is a responsibility for, those of us who have been in the world a little bit longer to provide some structure and guidance and mentorship in place. And in terms of the voting age, that might be where it is.
I'm not going to ask you if you want to be Prime Minister, but I will ask you if other people ask you if you want to be Prime Minister. Not
really, no. It's
come on.
No, well,
really?
It might surprise you to know that not many people think that highly of me.
Well, is
Look, I'm very proud of being the MP here, and you've probably seen it today, having walked around. It's a great place to live and to represent. And I'm very, very fortunate to also be a minister, which actually means I can double dip as well, because you're the Minister for the South Island, so every time you're at home you're doing your ministerial work, so there's no such thing as a holiday.
Is there another portfolio or any specific area of public policy that really interests you?
Well, I'm really interested in education, and I mentioned in my maiden speech the importance of it and how the fact that I don't think I'd be here without a quality education. And so I try and maintain a really good relationship with Erica Stanford and basically say, what can I do to help you deliver good education for us here in South Canterbury and around the South Island? I think that's the great leveller, that's the big game changer. So if I could ever assist Minister Stanford with anything she's doing, that'd be brilliant. I mean, I think that's really where you make the big difference.